Winter is coming in the Northern Hemisphere. Last year, energy grids across Europe were stretched, stockpiles emptied, and bills skyrocketed. So have the region's decision makers learned the lessons of 2022? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, with war raging in Ukraine around this time last year, Europe faced a crunch. It could no longer rely on Russian oil and gas during a long and particularly cold winter. 2022 took energy capacity to the brink. Will 2023 be any better?
Some have called it the winter from hell, not just because of the duration and the freezing cold temperatures, but because it affected so many countries around the world. In Europe, the war in Ukraine meant cutting reliance on Russian oil and gas almost overnight. The result was a sharp and sustained increase in natural gas prices, particularly through the summer of 2022. But winter 2023 is a different story. EU countries gave themselves a mandate to fill reserve supplies to 90% by the 1st of November. Those reserves are 95% full. The bloc has diversified where its gas comes from, away from Russia, as well as decreasing how much is used by 15%. There's also been an increase in liquefied natural gas. That's gas cooled to minus 160 degrees so that it becomes a liquid and can be transported by ship. Germany was the country most reliant on Russian energy imports.
Germany was too dependent on Russian energy for too long. For every cubic meter of cheap gas, we paid with our security, twice, 3 times over.
The EU is also moving away from fossil fuels altogether. Last year, wind and solar energy provided more of the bloc's electricity than gas, though from this chart, coal production has increased over the last couple of years. There are worries the transition to renewable energy isn't happening quickly enough. By 2030, it's supposed to make up 42.5% of the bloc's energy. So for now, this winter should be shored up, but are concerns over short-term needs overshadowing future energy goals?
Well, let's meet our guests. Maria Jaller-Makarewicz is an energy analyst for Europe at the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. She joins us from London. In Edinburgh, in Scotland, is Simon Francis, the coordinator of the End Fuel Poverty Coalition. That's a campaign group made up of over 70 charities, trade unions and local authorities. Monjur Mourshed is Professor of Sustainable Engineering at Cardiff University in Wales. And in Sheffield in the UK is John Grant. He's a senior lecturer in sustainable construction and climate change at Sheffield Hallam University. Maria, I want to come to you first. I think the one question all our viewers will be wanting the answer to is this winter going to be as expensive as last year's was?
We are expecting not to be that expensive, hopefully. We are in better conditions. The situation of the storage is almost full. The demand of gas and actually also LNG hasn't grown as expected. So we are hoping that this winter will be a bit better than previous one. But it all depends on how the weather will be.
Simon, is that something you'd agree with? It's going to be less expensive than winter 22?
Not in the UK, no, not by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, energy prices are still around double what they were in winter 2020. And some of the government support that we had in the UK last winter has been taken away. So actually, we think that as well, combined with the cost of living crisis, so you're actually seeing people having used up savings, used up credit card debt. Some people in research have even said they've been selling their possessions to fund their energy bills already, and that's before we get into the winter. So while we may have better security of supply this year, we certainly don't have more affordability of energy in the UK.
And Simon, just from what you're hearing from people on the ground in the UK, how worried are they?
Well, I think people are incredibly worried. I mean, you know, we're seeing people already making plans to only heat one room of their house. families, a third of families saying they're going to be going to bed early just to escape the cold. Pregnant mothers saying that they're going to have to go and spend more time in churches and libraries and other places that are heated by local authorities and by charities because they're so scared and because they cannot afford to heat their homes to a safe level. So, people are already making plans for a cold winter. And that's really just not acceptable in a modern developed economy.
Monjur, what is your reading of the pricing of winter 23? How expensive is it going to get?
Well, the key question is not how expensive it's going to be, but key question is how affordable it's going to be. So just like the previous colleague was suggesting or saying, is that although the wholesale prices have come down significantly from around 170 euros per megawatt hours, same time last year, to 47 euros per megawatt hours. But we don't necessarily see that reflected in household gas prices, primarily because there is a lag. So that's one issue. The second issue, what Simon was suggesting, is that people have already used up their savings in the last winter or in the last energy crisis, last year's energy crisis. And so it's going to be doubly difficult now for them to keep spending at the same or a little bit less.
John, what's your take on pricing and where we're heading in the next 4 or 5 months as long as the winter lasts?
Well, it's to be honest, it's terrifying. There seems to be very little preparation that has been made over this last year with regards to support. I had hoped that this would have been treated like an emergency over this year, and yet, here in the UK, the support has been fundamentally giving money to people so that they can pay higher price bills, rather than preparing those people so that they can use less energy, so that they can have, they can be less scared of whatever the future has to come. And so here we are playing some kind of awful Russian roulette, hoping that we're going to have another warm winter, which to me is just that isn't how, that's what you do when you don't have a plan, isn't it? That's what you do.
John, people will be watching from countries outside of the UK just wondering, where is the leadership politically in all of this?
Yeah, well, I'd like to know that too. We've seen in terms of our medium to long-term plans, everything being pushed back over there. And we have such fantastic opportunities to take the skills from our European colleagues. Just because we've left the European Union doesn't mean that we can't learn from our friends across the channel. Energy Strong in the Netherlands has shown us that we can retrofit our buildings really cheaply and efficiently, and that's it. The cheapest energy is the energy you don't use, and we're still struggling with that as a concept. We seem to believe that we will always need to use a lot of energy to keep us warm and to power our equipment, when energy efficiency is by far the cheapest solution to this problem that we're facing, and yet we see no leadership. You're absolutely right.
Anna Maria, I want to talk about the rest of Europe outside of the UK. How is the continent itself looking in terms of preparedness for winter?
Well, also I want to add to energy efficiency. For me, is a key factor for everything, and I think that's very important. How to save energy, and I think it will be great to see it replicated in lots of countries in Europe. We see other countries in Europe facing perhaps a little bit better conditions than the UK at the moment. They have invested a lot on heat pumps. So they have replaced some of their gas boilers for heat pumps. They are investing a lot of energy efficiency projects. So as one thing, we should see what has worked in other countries to see how can UK do it. When I mentioned that the situation was better globally for Europe, I was looking at it as a continent as a whole. But yes, if you see what is not reflected sometimes towards each of the consumers.
Simon, how helpless do people feel then? We're hearing about how well prepared the rest of Europe is and all of the thought and strategy that has gone into this elsewhere. The people you're working with, charities, local authorities, do they feel let down?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, not only has there been this failure of leadership where, it's that old saying, you should fix the roof while the sun is shining. And we've had summers and summers to try and fix the roofs and put in heat pumps and do insulation and all of those things that absolutely will help bring people's bills down in the long term. But the programs that we've had here have failed to deliver. They've not been given the consistent level of support. They've not made the most of emerging technologies. They've not made the most of reskilling and retraining the workforce in order to deliver them. And so people are left to then sort of fend for themselves. And that's why we end up in this situation, and we have done for many winters, where it becomes a case of trying to argue for more financial support, which, of course, as previous speakers have said, all you're essentially doing is transferring money from the state to the energy firms. You're not actually tackling the long-term systemic problems that we need to see. So we need to see that kind of long-term solution alongside the emergency support that people are going to need just to stay warm this winter.
I want to take a look at gas reserves across Europe. European countries have met 90% of gas reserves. So let's just look at what they have each individually for their own consumption if they relied on just themselves. So the chart we're looking at, the UK would have 12 days worth of reserves, Germany 89 days, France over 100 days, and the Netherlands over 100 days too. Monjur, why does the UK have such small reserves compared to other similar-sized Western European countries?
One of the reasons is that if a country is well networked with the European gas network, then they tend to have lower reserves. So UK we should have invested more in storage. We should have invested more in LNG import, liquefaction, and gasification as well, which we didn't. So we necessarily don't have enough storage capacities or long-term storage capacities in the UK, just like other countries.
John, how big a concern is that for you that all these other countries have, weeks and weeks of supplies there, and the UK has 12 days?
I know, it's extraordinary, isn't it? We're probably going to be relying on liquefied natural gas being brought in on trucks, on large freighters, and that in itself is an environmental disaster, because not only are we then buying from outside of our local economy, but also that method of transport of natural gas means you get a lot of leakage. Recent research is sort of putting the use of natural gas that's been liquefied, that's been frozen and then transported on ships is possibly worse than burning coal when it comes to the environmental impacts. So this idea of a bridging fuel even doesn't work. So it fails on so many levels, and we just rely on this idea that we'll be able to buy our way out of it when we don't seem to have that financial strength and the global markets to pull upon, because other people want that gas too.
What would you like to see political leaders in the UK doing, John?
I would love to see a proper plan to move away from the use of natural gas as a heating fuel for our homes. No, I appreciate you can't turn it off. That would be catastrophic. But there isn't a plan for zero use of fossil fuels, even though we're legally bound to not use that at some point in the future. We don't have a strategy. There is talk of heat pumps. I think that was mentioned by one of your other guests. And those are amazing, because for every pound you spend on energy, buying the energy for that, you get 3 or 4, maybe even £5 worth of heat out of the technology. But the amount of heat pumps that are being installed here in the UK is but a fraction of what's being done in Europe. And what an opportunity being missed for economic growth here in the UK. So yeah, I'd like to see a proper plan. And so it comes back again to leadership. But also I need people to be uplifted in terms of their knowledge, so that they're not terrified of what is to come. We still have an opportunity in front of us. And at the moment, we're getting the misinformation being weaponized and terrifying people about change, when it should be a better world we're heading for.
Simon, you're dealing with people who are vulnerable and I'm guessing are not the wealthiest people in your country, and they're very, very concerned about this winter. When politicians, say, start talking about heat pumps, is that even practical for people who are struggling to make ends meet every single month?
Well, I mean, that's why we need a proper plan to help people invest in heat pumps and in insulation and other things that are going to help keep them warm. And I think, the government actually has made steps to increase the amount of money that is available for households to install heat pumps. But I think that last point that was made by previous speakers is really key. Is what we haven't also seen is then a change in political rhetoric and a change in the language amongst people to actually try and encourage them and to try and demystify this process. There's still, I think, a very large vested interest in the oil and gas lobby, who are trying to keep us hooked on gas as a heating fuel. And so just recently, the government has announced more licenses to extract more oil and gas in the North Sea. You might think that would be a positive sign, but actually the reality is, of all the hundreds of licenses that the government has granted since 2010, they have resulted in just 16 days of extra gas coming into our grid, half of which actually was sent to the Netherlands. So, we have no reliance on our own domestic gas reserves. Shockingly, we have no actual reserves in place when you compare us with other countries, which means that we're at the mercy of the global markets, and we're having to pay whatever the markets want to pay. And if you've got other European countries storing up gas supplies, they've got more resilience, and they'll say, well, actually, we'll wait till the gas price comes down a little bit, and then we'll buy at that price. And in the UK, we'll end up having to pay the most for our gas of anywhere in Europe.
Anna Maria, just talk to me about how big a shock to the energy system in Europe it was when Russia attacked Ukraine.
Europe was depending around 50% of the gas supply from Russia. So suddenly they realized that gas was not going to come the way it was used to come. Then they decided in that moment, okay, what are we going to do? So, okay, let's try to bring gas from other sources. So the only way could be to increase LNG terminals. So they decided to increase the construction of LNG terminals, expand other ones. What are we seeing this year? That we still receive Russian gas via LNG. There's a lot of countries importing Russian LNG. So we are not diversifying from Russia. We are still importing LNG. And we are maybe expanding too much the LNG infrastructure for what the demand will be in the future. We have seen a quite reduction in demand in Europe this year. It hasn't grown as expected. And the forecasted demand for 2030, 2050 has even been reevaluated and is expected to be a bit lower now.
Monjur,
so I think...
Yeah, I just want to bring in Monjur. I just want to bring in Monjur and ask, the strategy seems to have been post Russia's invasion of Ukraine to reduce demand for gas and then increase imports of liquefied natural gas. Do you think that strategy is going to continue?
It's a short-term strategy. It's like using a Band-Aid. As Anna Maria was saying, is that this is not a long-term strategy. It should not be a long-term strategy. Then this infrastructure would not be used to its fullest capacity in the future. The strategy should have been, or should be, decarbonisation of buildings, decarbonisation of power generation, instead of relying on building heavy infrastructures of gas, natural gas.
Let's take a look at another important factor to consider here, which is Europe's decreasing use of electricity. It doesn't appear to be an accident. There's been a concerted effort, especially by countries like Germany, to use less energy and use what is needed more efficiently. So as a result, 2022 saw the lowest consumption in recent years. We can take a look at that on our chart just now. John, what's your reading of this winter? I mean, will Europe get through it?
You're asking me to look in the crystal ball here. I mean, statistically, in terms of the climate, we are looking at warmer, wetter winters. So, the idea is we're probably going to get hit with more winter storms, but the extreme cold is not going to go away but they're going to be what we would call here cold snaps, where you have a short period of very cold weather, but the average tends to be slightly warmer. So maybe this small amount of time that we have in our gas supplies might be able to carry us through. But, you're asking the impossible here. All I can tell you is that we're in a climate emergency and it's going to get worse and more extreme.
Simon, you're in Scotland. Scotland has colossal reserves of oil and gas offshore in the North Sea. There's something quite perverse about working class Scottish people struggling to heat their homes, going to bed early, wearing extra jackets in the house. I mean, how do people feel when you speak to them?
Well, I think, just to reiterate the point that the reserves of oil and gas in the North Sea are actually not really there. The geology of the North Sea is an aging field, and we've seen, very few days of gas reserves coming on stream as a result of the extra licenses that have been granted to firms. I think even the biggest license that's just been granted to the Rosebank field, that's only going to give us another year of gas here. So it's not really a solution to the problem. I think what also people look at, though, is the fact that we've got wind turbines all along the coast, all on the hills, we've got, which is great and is generating, a lot of energy. And we've got great infrastructure when it comes to hydroelectricity as well. But we in Scotland are actually paying more for our energy than other places because of the way that the UK's energy grid is constructed and how it's paid for. So we pay more per unit and more in standing charges than other areas of the country. Another part of the UK, Wales, where they again have huge amounts of energy reserves and especially renewable energy off the coast. Again, they're one of the most expensive places to live in the UK to pay for energy. So there is absolutely a perversion between us looking out our windows, seeing the wind turbines, seeing that actually we're generating enough renewable energy to power our countries, and yet we're still paying absolutely huge prices because we're so exposed to the global cost of electricity and gas.
Monjur, Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula, they're not massively well connected to Europe's energy grid. Should they be concerned if there's a problem this winter?
Or they should be, particularly the two shocks for this winter. One is if we see a cold snap, and number two is if there's any disruption of gas supply from Russia or from other places. Iberian Peninsula would be the most vulnerable.
Anna Maria, do we really need to be looking at a better long-term strategy now in terms of energy in Europe after Russia's attack on Ukraine?
I think we have to refocus on see how the demand has evolved this year. What are those repower policies in place that have worked? How much renewables have been in place? And taking all that into consideration, reevaluate the future gas and electricity system in Europe.
And tell me, Simon, what's your biggest fear this winter in terms of cost and pricing?
Well, the biggest fear is really the impact on people's health, and this applies, right across Europe. If you live in energy poverty and you can't afford to keep yourself warm, what you see is you end up living in a cold, damp home, and if you live in a cold, damp home, then you are exposed to heightened risk, especially if you have pre-existing medical conditions such as asthma or heart disease. If you are younger or if you're older, you can more likely to get ill. And ultimately what that does is put more pressure on the health systems. So what we often say is that energy poverty and fuel poverty is a public health crisis, but it can only be solved by economic and by engineering solutions. And that's what we really need to see to get us out of this in the long term.
John, can I just ask you, which countries in Europe are best practice then in terms of energy production and how they use it?
Well, I think the Scandinavian countries sort of set the standard with regards to heat pump installations for warming their homes and their performance of their houses. As I mentioned, the Dutch are really good when it comes to retrofitting their homes. An absolutely key solution. Their Energy Sprong team can do the retrofit in factories and then bring that on site and deliver that. You mentioned the Iberian Peninsula. They have made enormous steps with regards to switch over to renewable energy, as dare I say it, has the UK with its offshore wind. And now let's hope we're allowing wind turbines to be installed on land for the first time in over a decade. We might be able to actually take advantage of this huge resource that we have there. So the UK does have that, in there. But what upsets me is that, we have one of the highest tidal ranges in the world on the estuary around Bristol, and we don't even have a plan to even take part of that energy. So, the missing opportunities is a real shame. But, we have, as your guests have said, all the technology is in place. We just need the political will to employ them, and employ them at a level of urgency that I would say be roughly at the same intensity as the war in Ukraine. We need to take our energy supply as seriously as we take the invasion of Ukraine. That's a fact.
Monjur and all of our panel, thanks for your insight. Much appreciated. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.